I think we're live. We surely are. Hey, everybody. We're going to record a podcast on YouTube again today. And I'm just looking over here at my dashboard, making it so I can see your comments, hoping the audio is the audio. Oh, yeah. See, I'm overdriving it. Okay, good. So audio's working. It's not a very high level today for some reason. I'm wondering if I need to turn the gain up. Nope. It's a high level on my other thing. So anyway, today we're going to talk about extracting honey, and I'm just going to dive right in. Well, welcome everyone to Living Free in Tennessee, where we talk about building the life you want to live on your terms. Today is Wednesday, July 1st, 2020. This is episode 322 of Living Free in Tennessee. And this week I harvested honey. I didn't put it in this little bear yet, but I did harvest honey. And some of you may have noticed that there was no Monday episode. It happened on Tuesday because I also got stung in the process. And as it turns out, I'm allergic to bees now. Woohoo! Anyway, I realized we've never really talked about harvesting honey and processing it and the extraction process. And I haven't really talked about the bees much lately. We used to talk about them all the time when I first caught that wild hive. So today I'm going to talk about how we extract honey. Also, it's Holler Hat Wednesday. Head over to Instagram at Nicole Sauce and tell me what you think the Holler Hat is doing. Also, if you want to send feedback or stump the sauce or anything like that, you can do it, Nicole at livingfreeintennessee.com. That's Nicole at livingfreeintennessee.com. Hi, Kira. I just paused the recording to say hi to you. I don't always like to do the side chat on the podcast itself when we're on YouTube, but yes, you're catching one live today. I'm going to jump back in. With that, it's time for our first segment, and that is Stump the Sauce. And I have a Stump the Sauce segment that requires glasses. Okay. So this is from Sarah. I'm finishing up moving my stuff from my apartment to my house, and I have a ton of pickles. So many pickles. Basically, I decided I would make pickles as a Christmas gift, and I made some, and they were delicious, but they were softer than I would want as a gift. So I made more nicer ones that were crunchy. And as a result, I have way too many pickles now, and I totally choked, guys. This is where you see me do an edit live on YouTube. For some reason, the font on this particular email came into my notes really tiny and I didn't fix it. So anyway, lots of la 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 la. Okay. I don't generally just eat pickles straight. I get a craving once in a while. I'll eat a whole jar and then I don't touch them again for a month. Also, some of them are kind of floppy. Any ideas on how to use my pickles? Yes, Sarah, I do have ideas. One, pickle relish. So you can take your pickles that are already made and mix them with other things like onions and hot peppers and a little bit of sugar or maple syrup or honey. We're talking about honey today. And make that into a really tasty relish. You don't have to make pickle relish with cucumbers. You can use dill pickles. Another thing you can do is just start reminding yourself to put a pickle or two out with dinner as a snack. It's kind of nice. But I think one thing you may want to look into, and I'll include a link in the show notes, is cream of pickle soup. Yep, you heard me. Cream of pickle soup. I got the recipe from my dad. He sent me the link to the one he likes. And apparently when he was younger, one of the cafes nearby made cream of pickle soup, and it basically uses both the brine and some of the pickles in a creamy, yummy soup. And I'm thinking I'm going to try it, and then I'm going to try it with cheese. So it's almost like a beer cheese cream of pickle soup. Yum. I think if you get some of those things going, you may find yourself wanting to pickle even more or make even more pickles. Next segment is What's Up in the Garden. Well, it is high garden season for us here in Tennessee. And so the beans are coming on. I told you last week they would. They are. And I was out there the other morning picking beans and kind of weeding out the perilla from that patch. And I found pokeweed, like little baby pokeweeds growing up. So I grabbed those and I fried them up with some eggs after boiling them a couple times in salt water. And so we had eggs and poke for Monday, Monday breakfast. And then we also have green beans coming on. First tomatoes are ripe. Yeah. I put a little video up on Instagram today. I'm super excited. As usual, the Siegler striped have gotten ripe first. We had 3 today. I ate 2 and left 1 for my neighbor to try out. Cucumber plants are blooming but haven't set fruit yet. So in the front of the garden area, the front of the house garden, I have these 55-gallon drums full of nutrients, and they also have loofah plants in there. And I did a tour of that in April, and the loofah plants were that big, and they have stayed that big until now. And I had pretty much given up on my dream of having the vines go up on my pergola and provide shade and the loofahs hanging down so they get nice and long and aren't hitting the ground. I gave up on that dream. And now they're starting to grow. So apparently they just wanted it to be warmer. So note for the future, if I'm going to do loofah vines in a hydro system, I might as well just transplant them after about June 1st, because they all of a sudden they just started taking off and they're super happy. So hopefully that means I really will get my vine shade this year. Also, you can eat loofahs when they're little. So, I'm pretty good at killing squash plants with the squash vine borers. I have squash right now, and knock on wood, might actually get a squash plant before the squash vine borers come, but they always come and they always kill my plants and they don't touch loofah. So you can harvest them when they're, 3 to 6 inches long, not more than an inch around. And then they'll take on any flavor you want. They're kind of like adding a zucchini to something. I'm pulling out the rest of the beets this week and then reseeding with cucumbers and beans in its place. And right now, foliar feeding is really important in my garden. So I'm using some Garrett juice and some Dawn dish detergent and a little bit of calcium, magnesium, and zinc to spray them. I also add whey from making cheese from the goat's milk I have, just to give them as much support through July so they go into August strong, because the dog days of summer are coming fast. And if I can keep some of these plants alive through August, they usually kind of slow down in August and then come back to me in the fall. It is time, guys, to start your fall seedlings here already. So I'm getting set to start some broccoli and some other things that I'll transplant later. It's kind of crazy that it's already fall gardening time and summer has just began. With that, it's time for the main topic of today's show, and that's extracting honey and putting it in bears and how we do that. So I am by no means an expert on honey or honeybees. In fact, my method of raising bees, I'm not really a beekeeper. I'm a bee haver. So we have bees on the property. I don't keep the bees. I don't go through the hive on a 14-day schedule or anything like that. I go in there as little as possible. My bees survive by being left alone. And sometimes I lose a hive, and other times I get additional hives from them. And this method has worked for me personally for 2 reasons. I have a big fear of bees. I have a bigger fear of bees now that I have been on an IV being to learn how to breathe again, right? So that's kind of a thing. And that means I don't like fussing around in the hive. And the more I get into the hives, the more likely I am to get stung. And at this point, if I get stung again, anything could happen. It might not do anything, or I might have an even stronger reaction than the one I had this week. So I'm probably going to just kind of continue to not go into the hives much. I'm deciding if I'm keeping the bees. I think I will, though, because they're great pollinators and they make honey, and I love honey. So what I'm sharing with you today is the process I go through. I'm sure people who are more methodical than I am about beekeeping have different ways, and I'm hoping that this will elicit them sharing some of their practices as well. So first of all, here in the Holler Homestead, extracting honey from the hives is a 2-person process. My bees are kind of aggressive, and so when you go into the hive, they'll be calm if you're just in that top super because hives have like the bottom area where mostly the brood is and the queen, and then you have additional boxes. We call those supers on top of them with frames in them. And the higher up in the hive you go, the less irritated my bees are. If I get down into that bottom super, they start stinging your hands. Like that's how these bees are. Even with smoke, they just like never really like being invaded that closely. And sometimes we do need to go down there and get to the queen cells and squish them, but usually we just stay the heck out of there. I just stay in the top frames. It's still a two-person process because you can imagine they are storing honey for themselves to get through the winter. And so when we start taking the honey out, they get a little irritated about it. And here's how it goes. The way we've done it to date, my bee mentor friend Ken comes over and he goes in the hives and he starts pulling out the frames and looking to see if there's something we can keep. And then he hands them off to me and I use a bee brush and I brush the bees off the frames and keep walking farther and farther away from the hive so the bees will go back to the hive. And then when there aren't bees left on them, I put them in a container so that they're, secure from getting bees on them. What happened this weekend is I couldn't get all the bees off, so some of them went, and I was using a large cooler. Some of them went in the cooler with bees on the frames. So, first up, how much do you extract? What we've been doing here is no more than 50% of what's there, and we want to leave them with enough frames. Like for a hive with one super and like a half, we'll want to leave at least half those frames there now, just to make sure that going into the winter, they will have enough to eat, right? And then, if I have a couple of boxes, I might take a whole box. So I had one hive that had 2 deeps and a half, and I had a queen excluder. And the queen excluder basically keeps the queen in the lower half so that your frames up above have honey and not honey and brood. Because if you take honey and brood, you're basically killing future bees, right? Plus you end up with brood in your honey. Anyway, I had a queen excluder. So we looked at that hive, and by we, I mean Ken. And he took that top super off and he took a frame out. And what he's doing when he takes a frame out is he's seeing, is there brood in there? How full of honey is it? Is it capped or not capped? You want to make sure that it's 80 to 90, I would say 90% capped. Honey that's not capped is still evaporating and has higher liquid in it. The capped honey has lower water content. If you have too much water content in your honey, it will start fermenting in your jars. That's how people explode jars of honey. So if you harvest honey and it's not capped enough, you can end up with a problem later. So what he discovered was every single frame in that box was capped 100%. So I had a full box. They were built out extra thick. He could barely lift the box. He got in there and he was like, these are all good. And we have another, and underneath it, the whole box underneath it was also full. So what we decided to do is he handed me that box and we kind of shook the bees off, which really made them PO'd. And then I walked over to my storage cooler with the brush and I just took out one frame at a time, brushed the extra bees off and put them in the cooler. Okay. So that's how you choose frames, right? You choose the frames that have the capped honey, not a bunch of brood in it. And then you want to leave 50% behind. What we've started doing in my hives is one box holds 10 frames, but we're only putting 9 in and we're giving a little extra space because they'll fill a little extra honey there. And it feels like, I don't know, I've never measured it, but it feels like we're getting more honey per frame. And every frame takes a little bit of work to get the honey out, which we'll talk about later. So at this point, so what we did this weekend is we took that whole thing and then we went through the other 2 hives and took more frames from them. They were not as built out in honey as this one. Like I have this one banging hive that's just killing it. But I ended up with 10 or 11 or 12. I ended up with an odd number. So it must have been 11 or 13 frames of honey that we could then extract from. And I put them in that cooler. And as I said, I knew there were some bees in the cooler and I made sure the lid was tightened down. And here's why. You don't want ants getting in your honey. And by that time, we had been outside in bee suits in the sun, boiling our butts off for several hours. Probably about 2 hours it took us to get the honey and look at the hives, because while you're in there, you might as well look through and see if you need to kill any queen cells and make sure everybody looks like they're populated well. And got it all put back together, exhausted, dehydrated, closed the cooler up and brought it in the house so it wouldn't be out in the hot sun. At that point, bees are not getting out of the cooler, right? Because they're in the cooler and the cooler's closed. And then, cleaned up, and that was it for the day. Because at that point, if you start the next step of extraction, you're going to get exhausted, or one might overwork themselves. So, we had a good dinner, and I made arrangements to borrow the next thing. So tools that I use for extraction now are a centrifuge that has a hand crank, and I'll put a link to a YouTube video that I made last year when I was extracting honey, just to show you how it works. I borrow that one from a friend every year now. It's a great one. It's an old stainless steel centrifuge that you put 2 frames in and you spin it. But you can't just like throw the frames in first, because it's capped brood, that capped honey, which means that the honeycomb has caps, and if you put it in there and spin it, nothing's coming out. You got to take those caps off. I have tried multiple ways to take the caps off. The first thing I ever did is I just used a knife, and what happened is it destroyed a lot of the honeycomb. And what's nice to have happen is you extract honey and there's comb still in the frame. So when you give it back to your bees, they don't have to do all that work again. They can just start refilling it and do the repair work. So I didn't really love that method. And then I got a heated knife that you plug in. It's electric. It heats up and it kind of melts the cap off. And I ended up doing a lot more damage to the honeycomb with that. And now I use a tool that's like a roller, and it has little pins sticking out, and you roll it, and that does the least damage to the honeycomb out of everything. So the one I like to use to take the cap off of the honeycomb is the rolling tool with the little spikes that stick out. I know other beekeepers just prefer to use a knife, and that's all cool. So what you do is you take a frame, you take the cap off the honeycomb, you put it in the centrifuge, and then I crank it slowly, and the centrifugal force, or however you say that word, centrifugal force, gets the honey out of the frames, and it sticks to the edge of the barrel, and then it kind of slowly honey flows down the side, and then there's a spout at the bottom that you can put it in the mason jars, or I go into like large stock pots with it that are perfect for fitting under there. And that's because my filtering process comes next. So I prefer to have it in larger volumes than in small mason jars. Okay, so I do it slowly first, and then I take the frames out, turn them the other way, because there's honey and capped honey on both sides. And of course, I've taken the caps off both sides. And then I spin it again, only faster. And then I flip them around again and spin it fast one more time. And I do it that way because when the frames are really heavy and full of honey, it makes the centrifuge jump. And so I go slow to get some of the honey out and balance the weight, turn them around, get all the honey off the other side, turn it around again, get all the honey off. So once that's been done with all of the frames, I take the frames and I send them off my property because they still have honey goo on them, and bees love that. And I don't like to do work of cleaning up the frames myself because the bees will do it for me. So what I did this weekend is I sent it down the road to base camp where Tactical Redneck lives, and there's a nice covered area there where nobody ever goes, and just put the cooler that they were in with the frames there, and also the tools I had used for extraction, and let the bees clean it up. They'll get all of that honey they've already made and put it in their frames they're using now. And sure enough, by the next morning, they were there. Well, once I have that done, it's time to do the filtering process. So filtering and jarring. What happens with honey is when you extract it, some pieces of wax usually come out, and other bee parts or whatever. And if you just let it set, most of those debris will float to the top. So the first thing I do is I put it in my stock pots. I put the lids on it so that little flies and yuck can't get in there. And I let all of that wax and other stuff float to the top. And then I take a colander, like the screen kind of colander that you would use, maybe, like a big one, and I put it over another pot, and I use a slotted spoon to take that layer of crap off the top, and I put it through that strainer and just let the honey drip through. Once that's done, I take that what's left, which is mostly beeswax, and put it aside in a pot, and it usually still has a bunch of honey on it, that's okay. And then I pour the rest of the honey through that same strainer to make sure I'm getting bee legs and wings and that sort of stuff out. And, once that's done, I go straight from that other pot into mason jars, put lids on it, done. Now, what I have discovered is I put that, because this last one, I had 3 stock pots full of honey. So 3 times I went through that process of putting wax in the strainer and then putting it to the side. I took that ball that was left that still had honey in it before bed, put it back on that pot that I had been straining into, and just let it drip all night with a lid kind of on top of it to keep flies out. I ended up with a full quart of honey when I did that, and I haven't done that in the past. Usually I just, put that wax out, let the bees clean it up and go off. So I got an extra quart of honey because I let that just drip overnight. And I think if I let it drip again, I get a little teeny bit more because I'm seeing there's still a little bit of honey in my wax and debris. So once it's filtered and jarred, I store it just in a cool, dark place like any other canned food. I now what I do is I sell it right away, and sold out in about 2 hours this year. So I got the biggest harvest ever this year and sold out fastest. I was kind of surprised. I was like posting from the doctor's office on an IV, like, "Hey, I have honey for sale because I got to pay these medical bills." Personally, I used to keep a gallon of honey each year for me. That's 4 quarts. I use about 2 quarts a year now. So I kept 1 quart out of this year's harvest for me, and 1 quart for the guy who lends me his centrifuge every year, and then have sold the rest. I actually may have a second wave because there are some that I wasn't 100% sure it was in order. So if that happens, I'm going to do honey bears so we can ship some of it out too for some of y'all who are asking about shipping. If I end up with that left, we'll do honey bears next. Anyway, store it in a cool, dark place. And then there's the wax to deal with. So in past years, what I've done is given the wax, like put it somewhere where the bees could get it and, in theory, put it back in their hives. This year, I am going to clean it up and make a wax puck because beeswax is what you coat cheddar cheese with when you store it. Yeah. And I've been making cheddar cheese this year. So it would be nice to not have to buy beeswax. I have some purchased beeswax, but I can, dilute it with my own beeswax for my own property. And so I looked up how you process the wax, and you basically take a double boiler. You can pre-clean it by putting it in a mesh bag and using water and rinsing honey off, but you don't have to. You put it in a double boiler, melt it down, pour it off into something to firm up again, right? Because beeswax melts at a pretty low temperature. And then what happens is, if you want to, you can pour it through like a cheesecloth strainer to get some of the debris out, but the debris will sink to the bottom. I think it is honey and debris will sink to the bottom, and then you end up with a puck of wax, and then at the very bottom of that beeswax puck, you have kind of the yuck, and you scrape that off. And then if you want to clarify it more, you do that process again. And once it's as clarified as you want, you end up having a puck of beeswax that you can use for other things like cheese. So I'll be doing that actually probably later today. I'll start that process. And what I've learned about double boilers and cleaning them up when you're using wax, because I use my double boiler both for making pudding and for making fire starters with paraffin, is you use it and you melt the wax and you pour the wax off, and I use a spatula to get as much out of there as possible. And then while that pot is still kind of hot, I use a paper towel to get the rest of the wax off. In this way, I've been able to use my double boiler in 2 purposes. A lot of people who do wax and do other cooking with double boilers have 2, one dedicated for wax, one dedicated for food things. But I mean, if a little bit of beeswax is left behind and gets in my pudding, do I care? No, I don't care. It's okay to consume beeswax. People consume it all the time. And B, I just, I already have too many things in my kitchen. I don't want two double boilers or, the makeshift double boiler. So that's how I clean it. Anyway, that's all there is to extracting honey. I mean, the hardest part is getting the bees and keeping them alive. And then once you have it, you extract the honey and you got it. I have done other methods in the past where I cut out the comb and squish it and strain it out. It's not as good as the centrifuge. So if you're going to start keeping honey or getting honey, I highly recommend like join a beekeeping club or something. There's usually either shared access to extraction tools. Some of them are electric even, or usually you'll find somebody willing to let you use theirs as long as you return it really clean. I'm super lucky because I have hot water coming out of my hose outside, so it's really easy to clean up afterwards. And so it's not hard. It is apparently dangerous for me now that I have become allergic to honeybees, but I will wear gloves. What I learned this time, because I didn't get stung in the part where it was dangerous and I was in the hives, I got stung when I picked up a frame that I'd looked and hadn't seen a bee, and it was a plastic frame instead of the wood ones I usually use. And they have these little pockets where a bee can hide, and a bee was hiding and came out and just like, it was this finger right here. The bee stung the crap out of this finger. Like she pumped 3 times. She got 100% of that poison in this finger. And my whole hand up to my wrist was super unhappy. And then when I started getting lightheaded and, losing control of my legs the next day, I thought, well, maybe I better go get something. So now I'm on the roids, guys. I'm on the roids. So it can be dangerous. I've learned that I'm going to wear gloves next time I extract from frames, unless I've had them in the fridge or freezer overnight, because I just don't want to get stung again. And yeah, I guess I could have avoided it by waiting a bit longer and letting all the bees die in the cooler. I think they were all also pissed off because I closed them in a cooler overnight instead of letting them go back to their little homes. So how about you other beekeepers out there? How do you process your honey? I'd love to hear it. With that, if you like the show and want to support the work I'm doing, you can do it in 2 ways. One, get your coffee over at hollowroast.com. We've got like 1 pound of last month's honey coffee of the month left, by the way. 1 pound. We only had 2 pounds at the start of today, and then 1 of the pounds sold. So now there's 1 more pound that will be up. And there are a lot of other fun options, including the cold brew blend, which is great at this time of year to drink colder coffee instead of hotter coffee. Although, I don't know, I like my morning espresso every day. The other way you can support the show is by becoming a member over at livingfreeintennessee.com. With that, guys, go out, make it a great week. That's all about honey. You guys didn't ask any questions or make any comments after the initial hellos. So thanks for joining me on the live stream today. Pulling my glasses off. I forgot I had those on. Man, that one email was this big. That was kind of funny. So I appreciate you giving me your time and hope you enjoyed hearing about how we get honey here.